The Cursed Inheritance. Chapter 1, Daniel's Lavish Hamptons Lifestyle. Daniel Wright awoke slowly, stretching his arms over his head as sunlight streamed in through the expansive bay windows of his Hamptons home. The luxurious 300-thread count sheets slid against his skin as he shifted in the California king bed, the kind of bed only the truly wealthy could afford. Daniel had worked hard to attain this level of success, rising to the top of the finance world through cunning and calculation. Now, at 45 years old, he finally had everything he'd always dreamed of. The sprawling Hamptons house, filled with sleek modern furniture and artwork worth more in a single piece than most people made in a year. The garage with a Mercedes and BMW parked side by side, shined and polished daily by the house staff. And most importantly, a beautiful wife, a model 15 years his junior who looked at him with adoration. This was the good life. Daniel dressed leisurely, selecting an Armani suit from his walk-in closet before heading downstairs. The smell of waffles and strong coffee wafted from the gourmet kitchen. Jess, the housekeeper, was busy cooking breakfast. Daniel's wife Gabriella sat on a stool at the Granite Island counter, her face lighting up when she saw him enter. "Good morning, darling," Gabriella said, kissing Daniel on the cheek. "Morning, honey," Daniel replied as he took a seat beside her. "That coffee smells amazing." Jess brought Daniel a steaming mug along with a plate of Belgian waffles topped with fresh strawberries and whipped cream. "Will you be going into the city today?" Gabriella asked between dainty bites of fruit and yogurt. "No, I think I'll work from home," Daniel said, opening up his iPad to check the morning's headlines. "We can take the boat out later if you'd like." Gabriella's eyes sparkled at the suggestion. The 30-foot yacht was her favorite toy, aside from her red convertible Mercedes. As Daniel ate breakfast, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the life he'd always envisioned for himself. The rewards of a STEM degree and an Ivy League MBA. Years spent climbing the corporate ladder without ethics or morals to hold him back. Ruthless ambition was what it took to succeed. Now he could sit back and enjoy the fruits of that labor, a stunning home in one of the most exclusive zip codes in America. House staff ready to serve his every need. An expensive, beautiful wife straight from the pages of Vogue. Daniel Wright had it all. What more could a man ask for? As he sipped his coffee and watched Gabriella chatter excitedly about their day, Daniel felt utter contentment. This was the good life, and he had earned it. The American dream, realized. Chapter 2, First Disturbing Nightmare. That night, Daniel slid into bed beside Gabriella, both satiated from their second bottle of Barolo at dinner. Gabriella fell asleep instantly, her mane of blonde hair splayed across the pillow. But as Daniel drifted off, the darkness crept in. He found himself walking through the house at night, the room shadowy and silent. A full moon shone outside, illuminating everything in pale light. As Daniel wandered downstairs, the hair on his neck prickled. He sensed something wasn't right. Crossing the foyer, he peered into the living room. A dark figure stood by the window, seeming to stare out at the moonlit lawn. Daniel moved closer, squinting to make out the person's features. With a shock, he realized it was Gabriella. "Honey," he said, confused. "What are you doing down here?" Gabriella didn't move. She remained silently standing, her white nightgown glowing in the darkness. Unease flooded Daniel. This didn't feel like his wife. As he approached cautiously, the wooden floor creaked under his feet. At the sound, the figure whipped around, eyes wild and teeth bared. Daniel gasped. This was not Gabriella, but some twisted fiend wearing her face. Dark blood ran down the front of the pale nightgown. Daniel turned to run, but the thing that looked like his wife grasped his shoulders with unnatural strength. He stared into its deranged eyes, stark terror gripping him. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. The creature leaned in close, rancid breath hot on Daniel's face as it whispered words he couldn't understand. He thrashed in its grip, but it wouldn't release him. He opened his mouth to scream. And jolted awake in bed, heart slamming against his ribs. Gabriella slumbered peacefully beside him. Trembling, Daniel looked around the shadowy bedroom. Everything was still and quiet. Just a nightmare, he told himself, trying to calm his frantic mind. But he couldn't shake the vivid images. The bloody white nightgown. The fiendish eyes. The whispered words in some ancient, guttural language. Just an incredibly disturbing nightmare. Eventually Daniel's heartbeat slowed. But as he slipped back into restless sleep, he felt certain this wouldn't be the last horrific vision his mind would conjure to haunt him. Chapter 3, Daniel murders wife in nightmare. The nightmares refused to stop. Every night Daniel found himself trapped in different scenes of terror, always with the same shadowy figure posing as his wife. He began dreading sleep, drinking coffee late into the evening to ward off the inevitable. But eventually, he'd collapse into bed exhausted. That's when the twisted visions began. Gabriella, or the thing that looked like her, lurking in the shadows of their Hamptons home. Waiting. Watching. On this night, Daniel again dreamed he was walking through the moonlit house. Floorboards creaked under his feet. He hugged his arms tightly to his chest, steeling himself. When the thing appeared this time, he wouldn't run. He had to face it. Heart pounding, Daniel entered the living room. Gabriella stood at the window, just like the first nightmare weeks ago. Blood stained the front of her pale gown. As Daniel watched, barely breathing, she turned slowly. The moonlight caught her face, revealing the wild, inhuman eyes. Daniel forced himself to stand his ground as she approached. Her lips peeled back from sharp teeth in a gruesome approximation of a grin. He trembled but didn't look away. In a deep, guttural voice, she uttered phrases in that unknown language, circling Daniel like predator toying with prey. And then, between one breath and the next, she was on him. Clawed hands grasped his shoulders, her foul breath hot on his face as she shrieked invectives he couldn't comprehend. Daniel reacted on instinct. He plunged a hand into the pocket of his pajamas. Fingers closed on something smooth and cold. Without hesitation, Daniel swung his fist up, driving the object into the side of Gabriella's throat. Blood spurted, coating his hand and arm in slick warmth. The thing released him, stumbling back and gurgling horribly. Daniel stared down at the crimson-smeared dagger clutched in his fist. Where had it come from? But that barely registered. He kept his eyes locked on the gasping, blood-drenched creature wearing his wife's face. With a final bubbling shriek, it collapsed to the floorboards. The nightgown soaked up the spreading pool of blood. Dead eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. Just like that, it was over. Shaking violently, Daniel dropped the blade, backing away slowly. What had he done? Oh God, what had he done? He had to get away, had to. Daniel? He jolted awake with a scream. Gabriella grasped his shoulder, her face pale and concerned in the pre-dawn gloom. Just a nightmare. The same horrific nightmare. Daniel tried to calm his breathing, staring into his wife's confused but very much alive eyes. I'm okay, he gasped. Just another bad dream. But deep down, Daniel wondered if that thing, that blood-spattered specter, would someday stop haunting his sleep and enter his waking world instead. Chapter 4, Daniel framed for wife's murder. When Daniel rose the next morning, his head pounded. He hadn't slept again after that last hideous nightmare. Gabriella kept shooting him worried glances over breakfast. She could see the toll these visions were taking. After forcing down some toast and coffee, Daniel stood abruptly. "I'm going into the city today," he announced. Gabriella started to object, but he held up a hand. "I need to get out of this house." The nightmares were slowly driving him mad, he knew it. The only way to escape was to immerse himself in the real world. Daniel drove into Manhattan, the familiar skyscrapers grounding him. He attended back-to-back meetings, pored over calculations, barely stopped to eat. He felt almost normal again. The nightmares couldn't touch him here. As dusk approached, Daniel decided to stay at his apartment in the city rather than head back to the Hamptons. One night away from that house would help. Gabriella wasn't happy when he called to tell her, but he didn't care. He needed this. Exhausted, Daniel climbed into his firm, modern bed as the lights of Times Square twinkled outside the windows. No bad dreams would torment him tonight. He was sure of it. When the phone rang hours pre-dawn, Daniel was dead asleep. He fumbled for the bedside. Handset, blinking gritty eyes. "Daniel Wright?" an authoritative voice demanded. "Yes." Daniel mumbled. "This is the police. We need you to come to your Hamptons address immediately. It's about your wife. There's been an incident." Daniel sat bolt upright, sudden dread flooding his veins. No. It couldn't be. He drove back to the Hamptons in a haze, exhaustion forgotten. Police cruisers crowded the curved driveway of the house. Crime scene tape stretched across the front door. Daniel's gut twisted. Inside, he found Gabriella sprawled on the foyer floor, throat savagely slashed. Blood saturated the area around her body. Exactly like in the nightmare. Daniel fell to his knees with a choked cry. Gabriella, his beautiful wife, lifeless and cold on the ornate marble tile. Slaughtered in their own home. Rough hands hauled Daniel upright. He struggled to focus on the words being fired at him. "Covered in blood, murder weapon found with your prints." And then the cold metal of handcuffs locked around his wrists as the Miranda rights were recited. Daniel could only stare down at Gabriella's body, horrified understanding dawning. This was no longer a nightmare. That twisted, blood-spattered thing had crossed from dreams into reality. It had taken the woman he loved and left him to take the blame. As Daniel was shoved into the back of a police cruiser, accusations of murder ringing in his ears, he knew only one thing: he had to get away. Before that presence came for him too. He would mourn Gabriella later. For now, survival was all that mattered. Chapter 5: Daniel inherits Louisiana Plantation. Daniel sat silent and numb on the Greyhound bus as it rattled down Interstate 10 through Louisiana's swampy terrain. He'd slipped away in those first chaotic hours after Gabriella's death, before the cops tried to charge him. Before the media could plaster Hampton's finance tycoon turned murderer across the headlines like a verdict. He'd withdrawn as much cash as possible and simply started driving, putting miles between himself and everything that happened. Now here he was, fugitive from the life he'd spent years building. Daniel gritted his teeth. That thing had taken his perfect world away in one blood-drenched night. And it was still coming. He could feel it even now in the shadows clinging to the drooping cypress branches outside the bus windows. The vehicle jolted over cracked asphalt as they turned onto an older highway. The terrain grew increasingly rural, the scattered houses appearing more ramshackle and decrepit. They passed through a tiny town with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. Where was he going? Daniel didn't have a plan. He'd spent 30 hours on winding back roads and then simply gotten on the first bus headed anywhere but north. The path didn't matter, he just had to keep moving or the nightmares would find him. Daniel didn't fully tune back in until the bus pulled into another shabby little town and the driver called his name. "This your stop, mister?" Daniel nodded wearily. It was as good a place as any to disappear. As the bus rattled off, he took stock of his surroundings. Not much here except a bait shop, ramshackle motel, and gas station. Bayou stretched for miles in every direction. An old billboard touted swamp tours. Decades out of date, like this town itself. With a sigh, Daniel turned toward the motel's flickering vacancy sign. He was bone-tired. One night of real sleep, and then he'd decide where to run next. The bored receptionist passed Daniel a yellowed envelope along with his room key. This got delivered here a few days ago. Name's the same as the reservation. In his dingy motel room, Daniel tore open the envelope. Inside was a letter written in spidery script. Dear Daniel, if you are reading this, I have passed on. I wish to leave you my Louisiana property, Shadow Oak Plantation. I have no other heirs. You will find what you need there. I hope you discover the truth. You Uncle. Richard. Daniel read the letter 3 times in disbelief. He had no uncle, both parents were only children. And yet this complete stranger had left Daniel some old plantation. It made no sense. But he could hardly pass up the opportunity. This unexpected inheritance provided the perfect place to disappear. Far better than a cockroach-infested motel. In the morning, Daniel would find Shadow Oak and make it his sanctuary from whatever evil pursued him. He had no idea what horrors awaited there. That the nightmares had only just found their foothold, and soon they would drag Daniel into an abyss of waking terror worse than any dream. Chapter 6: Strange Occurrences in Plantation. It took Daniel half a day to locate Shadow Oak Plantation deep in the swampy wilderness. The single-lane driveway was nearly swallowed by vegetation and the property appeared abandoned. But the house's impressive columns and ornate ironwork showed its former grandeur. Using the set of keys left for him at the motel, Daniel entered through the imposing front doors into a cavernous foyer. Dust danced in the air and mud stained the checkerboard marble floors. Cobwebs stretched across the sweeping staircase. Clearly no one had cared for this mansion in years. Still, it would serve Daniel's purposes well. Over the following days, Daniel settled into a routine. He cleared overgrowth from the rambling gardens, chopped firewood, cleaned the least dilapidated rooms. Fixing up this crumbling estate kept his mind off darker things. He still watched the shadows from the corner of his eye, but the nightmares kept their distance for now. Until late one night when Daniel lay reading by candlelight, too scared of what sleep might bring to actually rest. He was just thinking of extinguishing the flickering flame when a faint creak sounded from the foyer. Daniel froze. For several breaths, all was silent. Then another creak, and the distinct scuff of footsteps on marble. Fear flooded his veins. That thing had followed him. Found him here. Grabbing the iron poker from beside the fireplace, Daniel moved into the hall. His bare feet made no sound on the worn runner carpet. At the top of the staircase, he peered down into the dark foyer, poker poised to strike. Empty. Nothing moved in the stillness. Yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of not being alone. Gripping the poker tighter, he descended one creaking step at a time. His pulse roared in his ears. Reaching the foyer, Daniel circled slowly. The front doors remained locked. All the curtains drawn. So what had made those noises? As he stood trembling in the center of the room, something brushed his ankle. Daniel leapt away with a choked cry, brandishing the poker. But it was only the cat that had taken up residence in the stables. The creature twined between Daniel's legs, utterly unfazed by his panic. With a shaky exhalation, Daniel retreated upstairs. Just the cat. His mind playing tricks on him. Right? Back in his room with the door firmly shut, the night passed without further disturbance. But the next evening, as Daniel prepared a meager dinner, the pendant lights over the stove began to sway. The oscillation grew more pronounced, crystal prisms tinkling. A breeze, perhaps, from an open window. But Daniel had closed them all to keep out the humid Bayou air. Apprehension creeping up his spine, Daniel watched the lights sway faster, their shadows swirling erratic patterns across the walls. A sudden decisive snap, and the cords went slack. All three pendants crashed to the floor in a glittering shower of shards. Daniel cowered behind the granite island, heart in his throat. This was no breeze. The broken glass and twisted metal seemed evidence of something wanting him gone from this place. Or perhaps just wanting him dead. For the rest of the night, Daniel huddled by the fire clutching the poker in one hand and a butcher knife in the other. But no more incidents occurred. Slowly his frantic pulse calmed. Tomorrow he would have to face leaving this estate behind, for clearly an evil presence already dwelled here. One he had no desire to confront alone in the dark. Chapter 7, Shadowy Figures Seen on Grounds. Morning dawned muggy and gray, tendrils of bayou fog curling across the unkempt lawn. Daniel eyed the wisp suspiciously as he headed outside to load his few possessions into the car. Anything could use the mist as cover to creep close undetected. Daniel hurried through gathering his things, skin prickling between his shoulder blades. He paused frequently to scan the tree line and outbuildings. Braced for some entity to come rushing from the gloom. But the fog remained still, hanging heavy over stagnant ponds and creeping vines that choked the once elegant gardens. The main house itself seemed to glower at Daniel as he tossed his bags in the trunk, its peeling facade and sagging porches resentful of his presence. Let it rot, Daniel thought bitterly. Whatever lurked inside could have the decrepit old place. Slamming the trunk closed, Daniel gave the property one final glance. That's when he spotted them, several humanoid shadows flitting furtively between the trees off to the right. Daniel froze, squinting into the mist. The shadows paused, lingering behind gnarled trunks. Watching him. Fear gripped his heart with icy claws. These were no tricks of the light. The hazy forms had shape and mass, moving with intention. And they were most definitely not human. With a choked gasp, Daniel flung himself into the driver's seat and cranked the ignition. Gravel spat from under his tires as he sped down the winding driveway far faster than was safe. Only when the crumbling plantation home disappeared behind a veil of vegetation did he ease off the gas, pulse pounding in his ears. Those flowing shadows wanted him to leave, Daniel was certain of it. Yet where else could he possibly go now? The money his uncle, a man he'd never even met, left him would quickly dwindle. Daniel had nowhere to run except back to the neglected mansion and its inhuman occupants. Wheels skidding on the gravel drive, Daniel slowed and reluctantly turned the car around. He had no choice but to return and stand his ground against whatever lurked here. If those nebulous entities wanted him gone so badly, they'd have to drag him away themselves. Returning to the house, Daniel retrieved the butcher knife and poker, gripping a weapon in each trembling hand. He stood in the center of the dusty foyer, turning slowly, daring the presences to come for him. But nothing emerged from the gloom of peeling wallpaper and cobwebbed corners. Perhaps tonight they would gain enough courage to attack, Daniel thought. He would be ready. Or end up dead trying. As Daniel settled onto the moth-eaten sofa that night, knives and fire irons strewn around him, he knew one thing with cold certainty: the strange events were escalating. Whatever haunted this plantation was merely toying with him now. But its lethal intentions would soon reveal themselves. And when night fell, draping the rotting house in shadows, Daniel steeled himself for the horrors to come. For the nightmares were done biding their time. Now, they had him trapped in their domain. Chapter 8, Occult Evidence Found. The first 3 nights, Nothing emerged from the darkness to assail Daniel where he stood vigilant watch, weapons clutched in sweaty hands as shadows slid around him. His sleep-deprived mind began to wonder if he'd imagined the swaying lights, scurrying figures. But on the fourth night, the presence made its existence undeniably known. It started slow, faint scritchings and taps within the walls. The occasional far-off clatter. Then came the voices susurrating all around Daniel in a language he didn't recognize, yet somehow knew was ancient and wicked. Torch in one hand, knife in the other, Daniel searched for the source as the sounds grew louder, the unknown words more insistent. The entire house seemed alive with menace and watching eyes. Retreating upstairs with his back to the wall, Daniel caught a flicker of movement at the end of the hall. A shadow detached itself from the blackness and slid beneath the only door he hadn't opened. The small library his uncle had used as an office. Daniel approached warily, the muttering alien voices concentrated behind that static door. His uncle had locked it tight and taken the key, but Daniel only needed a moment's work with the blade to jimmy it open. Hinges creaked as he eased inside, knife raised in shaking defense against whatever might await him. What he found within was almost more shocking than any clasping fiend. The shelves were crammed with texts of esoteric symbols and occult rituals. Candles dripped wax in ominous patterns across the floor. A desk held bottles of unmarked powders and herbs. And chalk circles were scrawled on every inch of wall space. Daniel's eyes darted wildly around this den of dark magic. Was this how his uncle had summoned the forces that now dwelled within these walls? Grimoires spilled open on the desk provided even more dreadful revelations. His uncle had been trying to resurrect some ancient thing, using shadow oak as a conduit for its unholy power. He'd succeeded, if the visible dark energy permeating the estate was any indication. But the ritual had clearly grown beyond his control, perhaps even claiming his life. Now that vile presence filled every corner, every shadow, ceaselessly trying to drive Daniel away or consume him. Retching in disgust and horror, he slammed and relocked the office door before those voices could spill out and overwhelm him. Back downstairs, Daniel knew he should flee immediately, and yet he hesitated. This thing, whatever it was, had followed him from New York, from his nightmares. It would track him down no matter how far or fast he ran. And he sensed it was not yet fully recovered from the ritual that had pulled it through. Weak and wavering, but gathering strength. Soon it would be powerful enough to slaughter Daniel as viciously as it had Gabriella. But right now, he still had a chance to fight. Crazy as it seemed, he decided to make his stand here and try to end this curse for good. Before the gaps between worlds widened enough for the ancient evil to cross freely into this one. It was the only hope left. Clutching his uncle's cursed talismans like weapons, Daniel set to work. Chapter 9, Daniel confronts Plantation evil. Night blanketed the rotting plantation like a shroud, but Daniel no longer feared the darkness. He knew what lurked inside it, and he would force it out into the light before this was over. Chanting the incantations found in his uncle's manuscripts, Daniel slowly circled the chalk lines binding the malevolent presence. His torch blazed, reflecting off the symbol-etched floor. Outside, the Bayou winds keened through warped walls, seeking entry, but Daniel's protections held for now. He lifted a copper bowl, continuing the harsh syllables as he drizzled a vial of blood into the ritual flames. Acrid smoke billowed, stinging his eyes, but Daniel didn't falter. Blood and fire, earth and darkness, the elements mixed in the bubbling cauldron at his feet. The house trembled under the force growing within its walls. Daniel's voice grew hoarse, but still he chanted, blood and sweat mingling. The presence pushed back against confinement, buckling floorboards and shattered panes. Something buzzed at the base of Daniel's skull, the entity clawing to get inside his mind. He blocked it out, pulling a pendant from beneath his shirt. An elder sign etched with runes glowed against his chest, forged to repel the primal evil that had tracked Daniel from the city. As he reached the invocation's climax, the fire surged high and Mississippi mud bubbled out of the walls, the summoned spirit's lifeblood. An unearthly howl shook the night air. The breath of 1,000 fetid graves wafted across Daniel's face, but he held his ground. No fear, no weakness. Not when he was so close. Wind tore through the house with hurricane force, broken glass and debris whipping through the air. The chalk lines burned with violet flame, the brazier boiled and cracked. Behind the wind's scream, Daniel heard the cries of an ancient intelligence wrenched from its abyssal domain. Remembering the bloody dreams that started all this, Daniel pulled a silver-edged dagger from his belt. With one violent slash, he opened his wrist, blood spraying forward to sizzle in the fiery cauldron. Voices shrieked from every shadow. The ceiling groaned as if barely holding back the weight of the heavens. Or hell. Then with a bone-shaking thunderclap, the fiery chalk marks collapsed inward, swallowing the cauldron, the blood, the mud. Daniel's hand shot out to catch something hurled from the vortex, a talon of blackened ash. All that remained of the evil spirit. Silence rang out, broken only by Daniel's ragged breathing. Trickles of blood mingled with rain dripping from ruptured pipes in the ceiling. It was over. He had won. The malevolent presence bound to Shadow Oak through his uncle's mad ritual had been banished for good, unable to survive the destruction of its physical fetters. Letting the dagger and ashy talon slip to the floor, Daniel staggered outside into the storm-lashed night. Cool rain washed his face, mixing with tears of relief. The Louisiana Bayou was once again filled only with life, not death. And perhaps now, Daniel could begin to heal as well. Chapter 10, Truth of Nightmares Revealed. In the quiet weeks after Shadow Oak's exorcism, Daniel slowly mended body and soul. He cleaned up the plantation home, removing all traces of the grim occult ritual and dark power once trapped within its walls. No reason for any future inhabitants to know what had transpired there. Daniel wanted no memory of it either. He walked the overgrown grounds each morning as birdsong filled the air, letting this peaceful place soothe his lingering grief and fear. The nightmares that had plagued him since New York grew less frequent, no longer haunted by lurking evil. For the first time since Gabriella's murder, Daniel allowed himself to think back over the events that had brought him to the crumbling Louisiana estate, so far from the glittering Hamptons home where his dreams had first turned sinister. What was the meaning behind it all? The answers came to him slowly, in firelit evenings on the porch. The entity had not selected Daniel at random for its sadistic games, it had been called by another, long ago. His uncle. The occult rituals intended to grant power and knowledge had allowed older, fouler things through. But the naive reaper was soon bound to the sinister harvest. Trapped, afraid, and trying desperately to warn his unsuspecting kin. So he sent the nightmares as a harbinger, gifting Daniel the mansion where he'd naively sown seeds of devilry. Hoping his nephew could succeed where he had failed and purge the evil from Shadow Oak forevermore. The truth, once revealed, lifted the last shadows from Daniel's soul. His uncle had not wished him harm, but wanted to arm him against the gathering darkness through a cult gateway. The nightmares that had so tormented Daniel proved not a curse, but a blessing. Preparation for the task ahead. With that understanding, Daniel found peace. The spirits of this bayou had cleansed away his hatred and fear as they had the plantation's darkness. All that remained were determination and hope. The future now lay ahead untainted, the cold dreams left behind. Wherever the road led next, Daniel knew he walked it with courage. For he had survived the deepest nightmares, and dawn's light yet beckoned. The Cursed Inheritance.